Okay, guys, 5 more chapters left. Going to start on chapter 11. Just loaded up my pipe with some crumble cake number 5 rustica. So I'm going to have something strong after dinner. Already did the cherry light. I hate that there's no flame adjustment on this lighter, but what the heck. Okay, Parnassus on wheels. Chapter 11. We were coming into Woodbridge, and I was just wondering whether to wake the professor when the little window behind me slid back and he stuck his head out. "Hello," he said. "I think I must have been asleep." "Well, I should hope so," I said. "You needed it." Indeed, he looked much better, and I was relieved to see it. I had been really afraid he would be ill after sleeping out all night, but I guess he was tougher than I thought. He joined me on the seat, and we drove into the town. While he went to the station to ask about the train, I had a fine time selling books. I was away from the locality where I was known and had no shyness in attempting to imitate Mifflin's methods. I even went him one better by going into a hardware store where I bought a large dinner bell. This I rang lustily until a crowd gathered. Then I put up the flaps and displayed my books. As a matter of fact, I sold only one, but I enjoyed myself nonetheless. By and by, Mifflin reappeared. I think he had been to a barber. At any rate, he looked very spry. He had bought a clean collar and a flowing tie of a bright electric blue, which suited him rather well. "Well," he said, "the sage is going to get back at me for that punch on the nose. I've been to the bank to cash your check. They telephoned over to Redfield, and apparently your brother had stopped payment on it. It's rather awkward. They seem to think I'm a crook." I was furious. What right had Andrew to do this? "The brute," I said. "What on earth shall I do?" "I suggest that you telephone to the Redfield Bank," he said, "and countermand your brother's instructions. That is, unless you think you've made a mistake. I don't want to take advantage of you." "Nonsense," I said. "I'm not going to let Andrew spoil my holiday. That's always his way. If he gets an idea into his head, he's like a mule. I'll telephone to Redfield, and then we'll go to see the bank here." We put Parnassus up at the hotel, and I went to the telephone. I was thoroughly angry at Andrew and tried to get him on the wire first, but Sabine Farm didn't answer. Then I telephoned to the bank in Redfield and got Mr. Shirley. He's the cashier, and I know him well. I guess he recognized my voice, for he made no objection when I told him what I wanted. "Now you telephone to the bank in Woodbridge," I said, "and tell them to let Mr. Mifflin have the money. I'll go there with him to identify him. Will that be all right?" "Perfectly," he said. The deceitful snail. If I had only known what he was concocting. Mifflin said there was a train at 3 o'clock which he could take. We stopped at a little lunchroom for a bite to eat. Then he went again to the bank, and I with him. We asked the cashier whether they had a message from Redfield. "Yes," he said, "we've just heard," and he looked at me rather queerly. "Are you Miss McGill?" he said. "I am," I said. "Will you just step this way a moment?" he asked politely. Let me relight my pipe, guys. Get a good light on there. He led me into a little sitting room and asked me to sit down. I supposed that he was going to get some paper for me to sign, so I waited quite patiently for several minutes. I had left the professor at the cashier's window where they would give him the money. I waited some time, and I finally got tired of looking at the life insurance calendars. Then I happened to glance out of the window. Surely that was the professor just disappearing around the corner with another man. I returned to the cashier's desk. What's the matter? I said. Your mahogany furniture is charming, but I'm tired of it. Do I have to sit here any longer? And where's Mr. Mifflin? Did he get his money? The cashier was a horrid little creature with side whiskers. I'm sorry you had to wait, madam, he said. The transaction is just concluded. We gave Mr. Mifflin what was due him. There is no need for you to stay longer. I thought this was very extraordinary. Surely the professor would not leave without saying goodbye. However, I noticed that the clock said 3 minutes to 3, so I thought that perhaps he had to run to catch his train. He was such a strange man anyway. Well, I went back to the hotel, quite a little upset by this sudden parting. At least I was glad the little man had got his money all right. Probably he would write from Brooklyn, but of course I wouldn't get the letter till I returned to the farm, as that was the only address he would have. Perhaps that wouldn't be so long after all. But I did not feel like going back now, when Andrew had been so horrid. I drove Parnassus on the ferry, and we crossed the river. I felt lost and disagreeable. Even the fresh movement through the air gave me no pleasure. Bach whined dismally inside the van. It didn't take me long to discover that Parnassing all alone had lost some of its charms. I missed the professor, missed his abrupt, direct way of saying things, and his whimsical wit, and I was annoyed by his skipping off without a word of goodbye. It didn't seem natural. I partially appeased my irritation by stopping at a farmhouse on the other side of the river and selling a cookbook. Then I started along the road for Bath, about 5 miles farther on. Peg's foot didn't seem to bother her, so I thought it would be safe to travel that far before stopping for the night. Counting up the days, with some difficulty it seemed as though I had been away from home a month, I remembered that this was Saturday night. I thought I would stay in Bath over Sunday and get a good rest. We jogged sedately along the road, and I got a copy of Vanity Fair. I was so absorbed in Becky Sharp that I wouldn't even interrupt myself to sell books at the houses we passed. I think reading a good book makes one modest. When you see the marvelous insight into human nature, which a truly great book shows, it is bound to make you feel small, like looking at the dipper on a clear night, or seeing the winter sunrise when you go out to collect the morning eggs. And anything that makes you feel small is mighty good for you. What do you mean by a great book? Said the professor. I imagine him saying it. It seemed to me as if I could see him sitting there with his corncob pipe in his hand and that quizzical little face of his looking sharply at me. Somehow talking with the professor had made me think. He was as good as one of those Scranton correspondence courses, I do believe, and no money to pay for postage. Well, I said to the professor, to myself, let's see, what is a good book? I don't mean books like Henry James. He's Andrew's great idol. It's always seemed to me that he had a kind of rush of words to the head and never stopped to sort them out properly. A good book ought to have something simple about it, and like Eve, it ought to come from somewhere near the third rib. There ought to be a heart beating in it. A story that's all forehead doesn't amount to much. Anyway, it'll never get over at Dorca's meeting. That was the trouble with Henry James. Andrew talked so much about him that I took one of his books and read aloud at our sewing circle over at Redfield. Well, after one try, we had to fall back on Pollyanna. I need to relight again. Having trouble with the pipe, the tobacco. I haven't been doing chores and running a farmhouse for 15 years without getting some ideas about life and even about books. I wouldn't set my literary views up against yours, Professor. I was still talking to Mifflin in my mind. Nor, no, nor even against Andrews. But, as I say, I've got some ideas of my own. I've learned that honest work counts in writing books just as much as it does in washing dishes. I guess Andrew's books must be some good after all, because he surely does mull over them without end. I can forgive his being a shiftless farmer so long as he really does his literary chores up to the hilt. A man can be slack in everything else if he does one thing as well as he possibly can. And I guess it won't matter my being an ignoramus in literature so long as I'm rated A1 in the kitchen. That's what I used to think as I polished and scoured and scrubbed and dusted and swept and then set about getting dinner. If I ever sat down to read for 10 minutes, the cat would get into the custard. No woman in the country sits down for 15 consecutive minutes, between sunrise and sunset anyway, unless she has half a dozen servants. And nobody knows anything about literature unless he spends most of his life sitting down. So there you are. The cultivation of philosophic reflection was a new experience for me. Peg ambled along contentedly, and the dog trailed under Parnassus where I had tied him. I read Vanity Fair and thought all about all sorts of things. Once I got out to pick some scarlet maple leaves that attracted me. The motors passing annoyed me and with their dust and noise, but by and by one of them stopped, looked at my outfit curiously, and then asked to see some books. I put up the flaps for them, and we pulled off to one side of the road and had a good talk. They bought 2 or 3 books, too. By the time I neared Bath, the hands of my watch pointed to supper. I was still a bit shy of Mifflin's scheming of stopping overnight at farmhouses, so I thought I'd go right into the town and look for a hotel. The next day was Sunday, so it seemed reasonable to give the horse a good rest and stay in Bath 2 nights. The Hominy House looked clean and old-fashioned, and the name amused me, so I went in. It was a kind of high-class boarding house with mostly old women around. It looked to me almost literary, and Albert Hubbardash compared to the Grand Central in Shelby. The folks there stared at me somewhat suspiciously, and I half thought they were going to say they didn't take peddlers. But when I flashed a new $5 bill at the desk, I got good service. A $5 bill is a patent of nobility in New England. My, how I enjoyed that creamed chicken on toast and buckwheat cakes with syrup. After you get used to cooking all your own grub, a meal off someone else's stove is the finest kind of treat. After supper, I was all prepared to sit out on the porch with my sweater on and give a rocking chair a hot box, but then I remembered that it was up to me to carry on the traditions of Parnassus. I was there to spread the gospel of good books. I got to thinking how the professor never shirked carrying on his campaign, and I determined that I would be worthy of the cause. When I think back about the experience, it seems pretty crazy, but at the time I was filled with a kind of evangelistic zeal. I thought if I was going to try to sell books, I might as well have some fun out of it. Most of the old ladies were squatting about in the parlor, knitting or reading or playing cards. In the smoking room, I could see 2 dried up men. Mrs. Hominy, the manager of the place, was sitting at her desk behind a brass railing, going over accounts with a quill pen. I thought that the house probably hadn't had a shock since Walt Whitman wrote Leaves of Grass. In a kind of do-or-die spirit, I determined to give them a ruse. Gotta relight. In the dining room, I had noticed a huge dinner bell that stood beside the door. I stepped in there and got it. Standing in the big hall, I began ringing it as hard as I could shake my arm. You might have thought it was a fire alarm. Mrs. Hominy dropped her pen in horror. The colonial dames in their parlor came to life and ran into the hall like cockroaches. In a minute, I had gathered quite a respectable audience. It was up to me to do the spellbinding. Friends, I said, unconsciously imitating the professor's tricks of the trade, I guess. This bell, which generally summons you to the groaning board, now calls you to a literary repast. With the permission of the management, and with apologies for disturbing your tranquility, I will deliver a few remarks on the value of good books. I see that several of you are fond of reading, so perhaps the topic will be congenial. They gazed at me about as warmly as a round of walnut sundaes. Ladies and gentlemen, I continued, of course you remember the story of Abe Lincoln when he said, if you call a leg a tail, how many tails has a dog? 5, you answer? Wrong, because, as Mr. Lincoln said, calling a leg a tail. I still think it was a good beginning, but that was as far as I got. Mrs. Hominy came out of her trance, hastened from the cage, grabbed my arm. She was quite red with anger. Really, she said. Well, really. I must ask you to continue this in some other place. We do not allow commercial travelers in this house. And within 15 minutes, they had hitched up Peg and asked me to move on. Indeed, I was so taken aback by my own zeal that I could hardly protest. In a kind of daze, I found myself at the Moose Hotel, where they assured me they catered to mercantile people. I went straight to my room and fell asleep as soon as I reached the straw mattress. This was my first and only public speech. The end of chapter 11. Chapter 12. The next day was Sunday, October 6th. I well remember the date. I woke up as chipper as any Robert W. Chambers heroine. All my doubts and depressions of the evening before had fled, and I was single-heartedly delighted with the world and everything in it. The hotel was a poor place, but it would have taken more than that to mar my composure. I had a bitterly cold bath in a real country tin tub, and then eggs and pancakes for breakfast. At the table was a drummer who sold lightning rods and several other traveling salesmen. I'm afraid my conversation was consciously modeled along the line of what the professor would have said if he had been there. But at any rate, I got along swimmingly. The traveling men, after a moment or two of embarrassed diffidence, treated me quite as one of themselves and asked me about my line with interest. I described what I was doing, and they all said they envied me my freedom to come and go independently of trains. We talked cheerfully for a long time, and almost without intending to, I started preaching about books. In the end, they insisted on my showing them Parnassus. We all went out to the stable, where the van was quartered, and they browsed over the shelves. Before I knew it, I had sold $5 worth, although I had decided not to do any business at all on Sunday. But I couldn't refuse to sell them the stuff, as they all seemed so keen on getting something really good to read. One man kept on talking about Harold Bell Wright, but I had to admit that I hadn't heard of him. Evidently, the professor hadn't stocked any of his works. I was tickled to see that all little Redbeard didn't know everything about literature. After that, I debated whether to go to church or to write letters. Finally, I decided in favor of the letters. First, I tackled Andrew. I wrote, "The Moose Hotel, Bath, Sunday morning. Dear Andrew, it seems too absurd that it's only 3 days since I left Sabine Farm. However, honestly, more has happened to me in these 3 days than in 3 years at home. I'm sorry that you and Mr. Mifflin disagreed, but I quite understand your feelings. But I'm very angry that you should have tried to stop that check I gave him. It was none of your business, Andrew. I telephoned Mr. Shirley and made him send word to the bank in Woodbridge to give Mifflin the money. Mr. Mifflin did not swindle me into buying Parnassus. I did it of my own free will. If you want to know the truth, it was your fault. I bought it because I was scared you would if I didn't. And I didn't want to be left all alone on the farm from now till Thanksgiving while you went off on another trip. So I decided to do the thing myself. I thought I'd see how you would like being left all alone to run the house. I thought it'd be pretty nice for me to get things off my mind a while and have an adventure of my own. Now, Andrew, here are some directions for you. 1. Don't forget to feed the chickens twice a day and collect all the eggs. There's a nest behind the woodpile, and some of the Wyandottes have been laying under the ice house. 2. Don't let Rosie touch grandmother's blue china, because she'll break it as sure as fate if she lays her big, thick Swedish fingers on it. 3. Don't forget your warmer underwear. The nights are getting chilly. 4. I forgot to put the cover on the sewing machine. Please do that for me, or it'll get all dusty. 5. Don't let the cat run loose in the house at night. He always breaks something. 6. Send your socks and anything else that needs darning over to Mrs. McNally. She can do it for you. 7. Don't forget to feed the pigs. 8. Don't forget to mend the weather vane on the barn. 9. Don't forget to send that barrel of apples over to the cider mill, or you won't have any cider to drink when Mr. Decameron comes up to see us later in the fall. 10. Just to make 10 commandments, I'll add one more. You might phone to Mrs. Collins that the Dorcas will have to meet at someone else's house next week, because I don't know just when I'll get back. I may be away a fortnight or more. This is my first holiday in a long time, and I'm going to chew it before I swallow it. The professor, Mr. Mifflin, has gone back to Brooklyn to work on his book. I'm sorry you and he had to mix it up on the high road like a couple of hooligans. He's a nice little man, and you'd like him if you got to know him. I'm spending Sunday in Bath. Tomorrow I'm going on towards Hastings. I've sold $5 worth of books this morning, even if it is a Sunday. Your effete sister, Helen McGill. P.S. Don't forget to clean the separator after using it, or you'll get a fearful taste. Let me relight again. After writing to Andrew, I thought I would send a message to the professor. I had already written him a long letter in my mind, but somehow when I began putting it on paper, a sort of awkwardness came over me. I didn't know just how to begin. I thought how much more fun it would be if he were here, if he were there himself and I could listen to him talk. And then, while I was writing the first few sentences, some of the drummers came back into the room. Thought you'd like to see a Sunday paper, said one of them. I picked up the newspaper with a word of thanks and ran an eye over the headlines. The ugly black letters stood up before me, and my heart gave a great contraction. I felt my fingertips run cold. Disastrous wreck on the shoreline. Express runs into open switch. 10 lives lost and more than a score injured. Failure of block signals. The letters seemed to stand up before me as large as a malted milk signboard. With a shuddering apprehension, I read the details. Apparently, the express that left Providence at 4 o'clock on Saturday afternoon had crashed into the open siding near Wildon about 6 o'clock and collided with a string of freight empties. The baggage cart had been demolished, and the smoker had turned over and gone down an embankment. There were 10 men killed. My head swam. Was that the train the professor had taken? Let me see. He left Woodbridge on the local train at 3. He had said the day before that the express left Port Vigor at 5. If he had changed to the express... In a kind of fascinated horror, my eyes caught the list of the dead. I ran down the names. Thank God no Mifflin was among them. Then I saw the last entry. Unidentified man, middle-aged. What if that should be the professor? And I suddenly felt dizzy. And for the first time in my life, I fainted. Thank goodness no one else was in the room. The drummers had gone outside again, and no one heard me flop off that chair. I came to in a moment, my heart whirling like a spinning top. At first I did not realize what was wrong. Then my eye fell on the newspaper again. Feverishly, I reread the account and the names of the injured too, which I had missed before. Nowhere was there a name I knew, but the tragic words, unidentified man, danced before my eyes. Oh, if it were the professor... In a wave, the truth burst upon me. I loved that little man. I loved him. I loved him. He had brought something new into my life, and his brave, quaint ways had warmed my fat old heart. For the first time in an intolerable gush of pain, I seemed to know that my life could never again be endurable without him. And now, what was I to do? How could I learn the truth? Certainly, if he had been on the train and had escaped from the wreck unhurt, he would have sent a message to Sabine Farms to let me know. At any rate, that was a possibility. I rushed to the telephone to call up Andrew. Oh, the agonizing slowness of telephone connections when urgent hurry is needed. My voice shook as I said, Redfield 158J, to the operator. Throbbing with nervousness, I waited to hear the familiar click of the receiver at the other end. I could hear the Redfield switchboard receive the call and put in the plug to connect with our wire. In imagination, I could see the telephone against the wall in the old hallway at Sabine Farm. I could see the soiled patch of plaster where Andrew rests his elbow when he talks into the phone, and the place where he jots numbers down in pencil and I rub them off with breadcrumbs. I could see Andrew coming out of the sitting room to answer the bell, and then the operator said carelessly, "Doesn't answer." My forehead was wet as I came out of the booth. I hope I may never have to relive the horrors of the next hour. In spite of my bluff and hearty ways, in times of trouble I am as reticent as a clam. I was determined to hide my agony and anxiety from the well-meaning people of the Moose Hotel. I hurried to the railway station to send a telegram to the professor's address in Brooklyn, but found the place closed. A boy told me it would not open until the afternoon. From a drugstore I called Information in Wilden and finally got connected with some undertaker to whom the Wilden operator referred me. A horrible, condoning voice, have you ever talked to an undertaker over the telephone? Answered me that no one by the name of Mifflin had been among the dead, but admitted that there was one body still unidentified. He used one ghastly word that made me shudder, unrecognizable. I rang off. I knew then for the first time the horror of loneliness. I thought of the poor little man's notebook that I had seen. I thought of his fearless and lovable ways, of his pathetic little tweed cap, of the missing button of his jacket, of the bulging darns on his frayed sleeve. It seemed to me that heaven could mean nothing more than to roll creaking along country roads in Parnassus, with the professor beside me on the seat. What if I had known him only? How long was it? He had brought the splendor of an ideal into my humdrum life, and now had I lost it forever? Andrew and the farm seemed faint and far away. I was a homely old woman, morally lone and helpless. In my perplexity, I walked to the outskirts of the village and burst into tears. I finally got a grip on myself again. I'm not ashamed to say that I now admitted frankly what I had been hiding from myself. I was in love with a little red-bearded bookseller who seemed to me more splendid than Sir Galahad. I vowed that if he would have me, I would follow him to the other end of nowhere. I walked back to the hotel. I thought I would make one more try to get Andrew on the telephone. My soul quivered when at last I heard the receiver click. "Hello," said Andrew's voice. "Oh, Andrew," I said, "this is Helen. Where are you?" His voice sounded cross. "Andrew, is there any message from Mr. Mifflin? That wreck yesterday. He might have been on that train. I've been so frightened. Do you think he was hurt?" "Stuff and nonsense," said Andrew. "If you want to know about Mifflin, he's in jail in Port Vigor." Then I think Andrew must have been surprised. I began to laugh and cry simultaneously, and in my agitation I set down the receiver. The end of chapter 12. I hope you guys are liking this. I hope it's not too boring. And I'll talk to you in the next time. Bye.